glad to be here from Chicago, and I wouldn't be here without my colleague, Dr. Peter Smith. We represent the Kennedy Research Center on Intellectual and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, as well as the Illinois Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. Chicago is a metropolitan area of 11 million people. I have no conflicts of interest, but have had grant and research funding as listed. And I want to describe in this presentation both the complexity of functioning and the many faces of individuals with Down syndrome. I know we build on marvelous advances in neurobiology and neuroscience. I had the good fortune of being in both Marilu Ostergranit and Roger Reed's laboratory when I was a fellow at Johns Hopkins Kennedy Krieger. They really taught me that the consequences of aneuploidy were malformations, growth disturbances, developmental challenges, immune dysfunction, and oncological vulnerability. But the key life course concerns are how do we measure the complexity of development across the life course? What are the common tools that can inform strengths and challenges in preschool, middle childhood, adolescence, young adult, and seniors? What maintains skills and positive trajectory in social adaptive learning, communicative memory, and social emotional competencies? A very daunting challenge, and we've heard outstanding presentations with respect to our communicative measures, our adaptive measures, our measures in the elderly. A framework could be, and this is based on Spilker, who constructed a handbook of the way to look at measuring outcomes in clinical trials, is to know that medical management, developmental interventions, and family supports intersect with family values, belief, and judgment. But then the outcomes must be multidimensional. They must not only include, I'm trying to find a pointer, health, growth, and neurological integrity. We've heard about functional skills, but we should include developmental and behavioral competencies. Most importantly, social interaction and community participation in children, educational success in adults, vocational and employment success. A framework of thinking about the measurement of function is based on Gordon Guyette at McMaster's. And in 1992, he said we should really be looking at the purpose of measures. Discriminative measures distinguish individuals with and without a particular characteristic. For example, the Stanford-Binet IQ battery is distinguishing those who meet the cutoff point after rapport is established and basals and ceilings are appropriately done as being more than 2 standard deviations below the mean. There are lots of problems with that. Predictive measures are an estimate of likelihood of prognosis or future status. Even though the Binet can give us a score, for example, like 67, that doesn't tell us which children with a 67 read, write, and spell. I have a sister with Down syndrome and a Binet of 67. She can read Harry Potter novels. She can read the King James Bible at Sunday services, and she can do graphic design on cards at a small business organization. Her IQ does not predict what her future status was. Evaluative measures assess the magnitude of change in function over time to capture change when it happens. In the field of pediatric rehabilitation, the Pediatric Evaluation of Disability Inventory, PD, has a caregiver assistance and environmental modifications, CA, caregiver's assistance, EM, environmental modifications, and that can capture meaningful change as one looks at one's interventions. In order to examine these evaluative properties, you must have a toolkit of assessments where the items are feasible to use in terms of the time required and what their cost is, as well as what burden they place on respondents. They must give consistent scores from inter-rater by different trained assessors evaluating stable children, or when more than one assessor observes at the same time, the psychologist would describe that as test retest and inter-rater reliability. And they must be valid, that is responsive to real change, whether there's loss or improvement in function, or whether there's stability in the absence of change. Professor Cassé talked about item response theory. I am not going to overwhelm you with the statistics, but the simple conceptualization of this is there is a continuum of item difficulty and person ability, and one can structure and order items along this continuum, and in that way one can understand steps and monitor progress more meaningfully. And this takes, just as Dr. Abuto talked about language recording, this takes a lot of detailed statistical analysis. The framework I would like to talk about, and we heard some things about it, is why choose activities of daily living. And I want to concentrate on that they can be criterion measures of basic functions that occur on a daily basis. Because every day I feed myself or I have assistance in feeding. I put on my clothes or I require assistance in getting dressed. I am able to manage my hygiene and brush my teeth and wash my hands and take a bath, or I need supervision or assistance for that. I maintain continency. I am able to move in indoor space and change positions, as well as in outdoor space and negotiate terrains and stairs. I have to understand information and be an active learner. That not only includes the concepts I bring to the table, but problem solving and social interaction. These encyclopedia of skills have been used developmentally, educationally, and in rehab, and Dr. Silverman was correct. They have not been used in intervention, whether pharmaceutical or outcome studies, in individuals with intellectual disability. The psychometric properties of these tools, whether they be the Vineland or the Patel or the PD or the APS, or as Mark just elegantly described, the diagnostic adaptive behavior or the WeFIM, they are highly correlated with each other. They capture key caregiver assistance. And in children 2 to 7, they have been responsive to change in those children challenged across a diversity of motor, communicative, and cognitive challenges in functioning. One tool, the gross motor function measure, has been used in children with cerebral palsy. There are multiple dimensions for discussion purpose A, B, C, D, E. There are frameworks of criteria, observations, and initial assessment. At reassessment, one can document the change. And from these trajectories, one can say that a child started out on a gross motor functional classification system level 1, which is walking without restrictions, limitation, and more advanced gross motor skills. Or 3, walks with a handheld assisted mobility device, limitations in walking outdoors in the community. Or a 5, self-mobility, severely limited, even with the use of assisted technology. One can do the same as the Scandinavians did, and they coined their scale, the Viking Speech Production Scale. It's an ordinal rating of 1, level 1, speech is not affected by the motor disorder. Level 2, speech is imprecise, but understandable to unfamiliar listeners. 3rd, speech is unclear and not usually understandable to unfamiliar listeners or out of context. And 4, no understandable speech. The significance of looking at this is then one could do gross motor functional classification curves, where on the y-axis, GMFM 66 is the gross motor functional measure, 66 determined by rash analysis and item response theory, and one could see curves of growth. Similarly, one sees over time that there is a group of individuals, especially below the 50th percentile, who are declining in function. And both those properties are critically important as we try to figure out those things that are helpful and have positive trajectories, and those things that are challenges. And embedded in the heterogeneity of individuals with Down syndrome are similar challenges, as I have illustrated with something that is very basic, motor function. Chicago has a long tradition of critically looking at the complexity of development. Mellon and White in 1973 summarized, prior to the era of IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disability Educational Act, the outcome of 612 children. Self-mobility and sitting balance was mastered by age 2 in 95% of the subjects. The rule and classical neurology for children who have had epilepsy or newborn encephalopathy or have a degree of cerebral palsy is that all children become independent walkers who have sitting balance by age 2. So the motor prognosis was well known. Independent walking by age 3.5, 95%. Toilet training by age 5.5, 95%. Speaking in phrases by age 6, 95%. The lesson from this historical cohort, and Dr. Silverman emphasized that there have been dynamic changes in both medical care and survival, is even in a different era of fragmentation and isolation, basic mobility, continency for bowel and bladder, and communication skills were established prior to official school entry, first grade. Sig Huchel, when he was at Boston Children's Hospital with Dr. Alan Crocker, Peter's mentor, did a randomized clinical trial in the 1970s of 5-hydroxytryptamine and pyridoxine in individuals with Down syndrome. And though this trial did not demonstrate a superiority of one pharmacological agent over the other, it did demonstrate some challenges in safety because 10% of children in this study developed infantile spasms, a very complex neurology complication. Puschel demonstrated that both mental and motor progress, mental in red, motor in yellow, systematically occurred in the first 3 years of life. If we look at that in terms of developmental quotients, we can see that at age 1 year, the average developmental quotient was 57 in red. At 2 years, it was 58. And at 3 years, it was 58. Because motor challenges became complex, especially like hopping on one foot and other dimensions that are captured in 3-year-old motor activity, there was a subtle difference from 60 to 54. At age 3, the Bailey MDI, the cognitive measure, was 58. The PDI, the motor measure, was 53. A standard score is 100 plus or minus 15, so these are more than 2 standard deviations below the mean. Receptive language, not using the Baileys, but using a valid assessment at that time, were 52. Expressive language, 46. But the Vineland social quotient was 64. Okay. And this replicated our knowledge, which is individuals with Down syndrome have strengths in social skills, have some relative inefficiencies in motor skill, and have challenges in speech, but are stronger in language understanding. And this replicated Professor Scher's experience in the 1960s in Los Angeles, where he demonstrated that the majority of children aged 3 to 5 years old with Down syndrome did not have severe intellectual disability. There was a big debate that it is inevitable that everyone ultimately tests as severe intellectual disability with Down syndrome, and that is not true, as everyone knows. So let's move forward to the current era, and Besutzak and colleagues at Emory looked at the neurodevelopmental outcomes in children with Down syndrome and congenital heart malformations. This was reported in the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 2011. And this slide demonstrates the heterogeneity of the cohort. They were 14 months Down syndrome plus atrioventricular septal defect, AVSD. There were 12 children there, and Down syndrome without structural congenital heart disease confirmed by echocardiology. That was a sample size of 17. That the mean age at initiation was 14 months. That there were roughly slightly more males than females. Representing the diversity of Atlanta, there was a significant representativeness of blacks and a small representatives of Hispanics. There was diversity in social economic status, and you can see total family income less than $50,000 US, what many people consider a livable wage, versus greater than $50,000 versus refusal to disclose. And so predominantly the families had sustainable economic resources. And education was also diverse, with paternal education of 4 years of college being 4 out of the 12 and 8 out of the 17. and you can see maternal education. Now, these are what the Baileys look like in terms of their cognitive standard score, their language standard score, and their motor standard score. And these authors found that those individuals in black that represent Down syndrome with atrioventricular septal defect always did less well across the Baileys, but in particular in motor. And the motor difference of 61 versus 68 meets in this small sample a statistically significant difference. So what did they conclude? That the Bailey 3 cognitive scores and language scores were lower in those with Down syndrome and atrioventricular septal defect compared to those with Down syndrome and structurally normal hearts, but not significantly. And these finally highlighted the values in the US of using the current Bailey 3 scales as one tool for measuring outcomes of young children with Down syndrome. Again, we must go beyond infancy and go to the preschool and elementary school years. Cornwell and Birch in the 1960s demonstrated the value of the violence in individuals with Down syndrome. This longitudinal sample showed that over time, on the x-axis between 5 and 15 years, the Vineland as a social maturity age made step-by-step incremental progress. The Binet, not so much. Though there was cognitive growth, it was not as robust as what one could capture with the Vineland. And more recently, Helen Leonard and colleagues, and I'm in that group, it's not just Leonard and I, systematically looked at school functional status of individuals with Down syndrome in the Western Australia Down Syndrome Registry, which involved over 200 individuals. And what one can see is that, severe challenges in functioning requiring assistance or help are in the minority for activities of daily living, bowel and bladder, ambulation, communication, and social skills. Some supervision is required across these dimensions, and a substantial number of individuals are independent in all basic ADLs, able to feed, able to dress, able to maintain basic hygiene, in bowel and bladder, able to use the bathroom and not require assistance, certainly in ambulation, and with some challenges in communication. And if one combines the yellow and the red, one can look at that as these are individuals who are not needing hands-on assistance, while the blue is those who are. Chicago was also the site with George Smith, co-author of the second edition of Penrose and Smith, Down's Anomaly, and with Donna Spiker, Carol Peterson, now Rowland, Dante Sacchetti, a well-known psychologist, and Pauline Justine. They examined the use of megavitamins with minerals in children with Down syndrome. This was based on the anecdotal report by Harrell in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, based on Linus Pauling's megavitamin theory that individuals with intellectual disability or behavior disorders or major mental health disorders could make progress when put on megavitamins. In this initial observation of 16 children, 4 had Down syndrome, and 3 children over an 8-month window showed the greatest improvement. So this group at Illinois Masonic Hospital had a RCT where 28 got the vitamin minerals and 28 got the placebo. The children were approximately 11 years. Their cognitive age, as measured by the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, was equal at inception. There was diverse SES status. And at that time, again, we were just getting idea off. There were only children, that most of the children were only just getting out of restrictive environments and being exposed to inclusive education. This slide is very busy, and it is the Wechsler scales, full scale, verbal performance, those who are supplemented with multiple vitamins, those who get the placebos, their standard deviation in the range. There is no change. There is no decline. This means that the children continue to make progress, but IQ isn't captured as a measure that shows progress. If one looks at communicative and visual skills, one can use the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. Those with the supplements increased at baseline from a mean score of 54 to 61 at 4 months. I'm rounding off to 57 at 8 months. The placebo group also made some change, but not significant, but change occurred. And in the visual motor integration test, the Berry, one can see at baseline 56, and this is 58.5 at 6 months, and similar, not as much change in the placebo. And one could do a more detailed measure, the Brunick-Ostrowski test of motor proficiency, called the BOTMP, for the initials around that. And one can also see change occurs. Absolute scores increase from 18.6 to 23. And again, depending on what endpoints is of the study, there are various measures, whether one uses cognitive, whether one uses motor, whether one uses adaptive, that will capture different dimensions. So these authors concluded there's continued developmental growth in school-age children with Down syndrome. The variation in test performance is part of the diversity of individuals with Down syndrome. They thought that in order to understand and interpret change, one had to know the home, school, and community factors that were contributing to this variation. And to date, there hadn't been a lot of experience in systematically, consistently tracking individuals in their progress. The only longitudinal study that I know is Janet Carr. And she felt in the UK that the most sensitive manifestation of regression was activities of daily living. Her battery included the Bailey at 6 months, the Merrill-Palmer at 11, the lighter nonverbal intelligence test at 21, the British Picture Vocabulary Test, a test of social and emotional functioning developed by Elizabeth Wing called the HBS, and other measures listed for memory and dementia. The first thing is I want everybody to see that the mean lighter nonverbal IQs for the men at 21 years was 42, and at 45 was 42. That the mean for the women was 49, and 2 women became demented. And so the scores had dropped to 41 at 45, but if they're excluded, what's known as the healthy group, the results are more subtle, 49 versus 46. And you can see similar changes, except to note these gender differences. And these are predominantly, though not all, premenopausal genetic differences in keeping with Wayne's estrogen hypothesis. The women were doing better on single word vocabulary with scores in the 70s. And then the total adaptive composite sequentially increased. So there are batteries, and this is a busy slide. I won't go into the details. I have assembled them in a multi-dimensional toolkit. I have included things that my therapy colleagues say make a difference, like postural control in a setting of hypotonia. That's why I list the AIMS, the Alberta Infant Motor Scale. I give a choice of cognitive skills, whether to use the Bailey, or to use the Griffiths, or to use the Brunet-Lazine. I give a strategy for social, emotional, and adaptive, emphasizing in early childhood criteria, small step instruments like the WIDEA, but they can be complicated, complemented by the DAS that was so elegantly described previously. In preschool children, one needs to measure motor. One should have a nonverbal cognitive IQ like the lighter. One should measure basic concepts like the bracken, which will capture colors, letters, numbers, sizes, shapes, and comparisons. And again, do social, emotional, and adaptive. And one can continue in school age. I'm not going to go into elders. Wayne and Ira were elegant in that, but it's interesting, without knowing what they were up to, that some of their overlap with memory and the idea of the mini mental status test, developmental disabilities, we overlap on. But the DBP Chicago model is this: examine sequential outcomes after implementing translational science and community interventions so that disability is prevented, function optimized, and we create systems of care to eliminate healthcare disabilities for vulnerable children, especially for those with intellectual disability. My colleague Jim Heckman did this model where he looked at the Perry Preschool Project and came away and said that developmental competencies beget developmental competencies, that social, emotional, and adaptive competencies beget social, emotional, and adaptive competencies. And it's much better to bend the curves in the preschool and elementary school than to mop up for the crisis later on. And when he does the calculation, he finds that for every dollar invested, there is a rate of return of almost $9, or $8.74 to be exact. You and I could not be an inside trader in the U.S. stock market, which at its time has had its level of corruption, and make this return on investment. The reason I bring this up is that what we're doing makes a difference both for the individual child, for the family, and for the community. And I wouldn't have been able to do this without support and grants, inspiration from my mother, my sister Christiane with Down syndrome, Robert E. Cook, who was my mentor and had 2 children with Creta Shaw. I list Mary Lou and Roger Reeves, who excited me about the science. But here, Sylvia and Franz, as well as Dominique, have been indispensable. I list my colleagues. This is my sister in front of her large home, which is in suburban Chicago. She is the second one on my right. My brother and my sister Julie from Australia are all part of Team MSALL. On the far right is my sister Madeleine, and all of us together are part of this effort for enhancing outcomes in life quality. Thank you very much.